Hello and welcome to another episode of The Coder Career with me, Cameron Blackwood. Today's guest is Colin Riddell. Colin is one of the growing contingent of guests who are also from the central belt of Scotland. And this episode should be extra special because as well as being a highly experienced developer himself, Colin actually spent a number of years as the lead instructor at CodeClan, which is Scotland's #1 bootcamp. What this means is that Colin has seen firsthand what it takes to learn to code, stand out and get that first job in tech. This episode is particularly good if you're in the process of learning and maybe trying to get that first job within the next year. But I'd recommend it to really anyone of all experience levels because Colin's got a ton of useful insight. If you do want to support the Coder Career financially, there is a Patreon page. However, don't feel obliged to do this, especially if you're currently looking for a job. If you do want some advice and to chat with our community, Discord's probably the best place, and there is a link to that in the description. You can, of course, join that for free. And for now, grab a coffee, push those commits, and enjoy the show. Hi, Colin. Welcome to the Coder Career. Thanks so much for joining me. How are you doing?
Hey, Cameron. Thanks very much for having me. I'm pretty well.
Good. It usually ends up we usually have to speak about the weather on here, but obviously because we're relatively close by to each other, it's fine, and we've dodged most of the storm and rain compared to our cousins down south. So we've done all right. But
It's pretty good to not have to trudge through snow.
Yeah, absolutely, or not fish the wheelie bin out from a pond that's formed at the end of your street or something like that. So it's always quite nice for sure. And so for listeners who haven't come across you before, maybe on LinkedIn or something, do you want to give a bit of a rundown about who you are and what you do?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm guessing probably not a lot of people have heard of me, and unless you maybe went to CodeClan. So I'm an engineer, a software engineer. I've been a software engineer for 14, 15 years now, and I've previously worked at CodeClan, which is the Scottish, or one of the only Scottish training academies, kind of like a bootcamp, a coding bootcamp, software engineering bootcamp. And before that, I've done a bunch of different roles in the industry. I've been a product manager for software teams. I've been kind of low-level engineering, kind of like low-level C++ compiler stuff, server application stack, back-end, front-end, and I now work at Fanduel. So I've worked at a few places, and I've been lucky enough to see a lot of different things and travel a fair bit with that as well, which has been really cool.
Well, that bodes wonderfully well for a good episode of the podcast with all that experience.
Hopefully.
So that sounds really good.
Thanks.
Cool. And so, as you know, having listened to the podcast before, we like to warm up with a few quick fire questions for the guest, just so the audience gets to know you a little bit better and find out about what you're all about in your story. So the first one is always the big one. What was your first ever computer?
I was listening to your podcast this morning, and I remember I really enjoyed the last couple of stories. And my first computer was an Amiga 500. It was one of the early Amigas. It had a floppy disk drive. It had 16-bit color screen. It had an OS that you had to load in from the floppy disk. It's just like a weird You would basically turn this thing on, right, and it would come up this blue screen or a purple screen. I can't remember if it was blue or purple. I think I've been preconditioned by Windows to think it's blue, but it probably actually was purple. And it had this icon of a disk getting loaded in to tell you that you need to actually load a disk in, because it didn't have any of its own ROM. So you'd load a disk in, then wait, and then it would load up a game or whatever. But it was mostly for gaming and things like that.
Yeah,
that was my first
common theme with the first one, and makes you grateful for the SSDs today with a boot time of sort of 2 seconds. I can't. I think my first computer would have been sort of Windows 98. So never loading it on from a floppy disk or anything. But I think I'm probably I've seen a floppy disk before, but never actually used one.
It's so weird for you to say that with me just listening to the podcast this morning, and then the last podcast or this morning's podcast, sorry. And then you were saying exactly that you've never touched one. And I thought we'll be talking about that this afternoon, and here we are.
Yeah, exactly. And I think I've said on the podcast before, a lot. I think people younger than me just know it as a save icon and nothing else.
Yeah, it's good that it translates, though.
Yeah, it does. Yeah, it does. And yeah, I quite like it. It's iconic. I hope they keep it and don't just change it to a cloud like a few places have done.
Oh
Um,
no,
yeah, it just doesn't gel. I just don't like it. I think
no,
a floppy disk,
no. I,
you know,
I agree with you on that.
if it ain't broke. And you already mentioned you're a pretty well travelled guy. What's your favourite tech city?
Oh yeah, good question. There's a few good tech cities. I've not been to them all. I was really quite taken with Tokyo, and I know that's the same answer as a couple of your previous guests. Apologies for that. But it's definitely got that weird paradigm of being ultra high tech, but also a little bit weirdly backwards as well. Their
Hmm.
processes and the way they do things, their working culture is just a bit weird. And you go to work after you've had dinner, and you like sometimes sleep in the office, and things are very pen and paper in Japan. Um, Software engineers kind of haven't, or at least when I was there, 2011, I think I was there. They haven't quite got the same level of um, like working practices that are really like forward thinking, if that makes sense. At least the teams that I worked with, it may just be like that company or those individuals, but I kind of got the impression it was a few other companies in Tokyo were kind of like that. Um, One of the really cool things about when I was in Tokyo was the company I was working for at the time. We were basically making a compiler uh, that would there was a product for the PlayStation 3. So the idea, we were selling a product or trying to build a compiler product that you could use as an alternative to the PS3 SDK. Um, so we went to Sony to try and get some more info around the PS4 at that time. And we went to their main head office in Tokyo and went to meet with them. And it was one of the coolest experiences in my life in terms of my professional life, because it's just this huge building, very 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 like giant glass structure, as you can imagine. And apparently, legend has it that like the lower floor, the first floor that you go in on this building, is basically full of like offices. It's full of like almost like booth type offices. And what you're meant to do is, if you're a guest, you don't get to visit the higher floors, right? You're not allowed. So basically, what they have is they basically have the downstairs of this entire huge building is just for like meetings. So you go and you have your meeting, and if you get invited to like the first floor or above, then it's like a special honor. And we got invited to the first floor or above, so it was one of the coolest things. I just had to go against what my boss was telling me about all this stuff back then. Good times.
That must be a really cool experience
Yeah,
to
it was.
work somewhere that's just so different. And also, as a major PlayStation fanboy myself, like
Yeah,
working on a project like that sounds awesome. And
yeah,
so is that? I'm guessing from you were talking about compilers and stuff. Was that when you were doing the low level programming?
yeah. So I came out of university in 2008, which makes me a bit of an old timer now, I realise, but it doesn't really feel like that long ago in the grand scheme of things. Um, and I done computer science and software engineering at University of Stirling, and I came out not quite knowing really exactly what I wanted to do. I know that I was interested in games, and I think a lot of like people in my situation, a lot of white males tend to kind of, or just males in general, tend to like gravitate towards the games industry, and like it seems to be like the thing that everyone wanted to do. So I was kind of quite interested in that, but wasn't quite sure about it. In 2008, we didn't have the same kind of software engineering tech culture and scene that we have now. So it wasn't you couldn't, for example, go onto YouTube and learn stuff. You couldn't just pick up a book and start coding as easily. It seemed like it was a bit kind of harder to get into it in a weird way. Um, so it wasn't obvious what I wanted to do. So I went to this company that I thought sounded like an interesting company, and based in Edinburgh. The company was called Codeplay. The company actually still exists, and they're doing really well. And they now focus on a lot of stuff to do with like AI machine learning. Over the time that I was there, we started to move from kind of normal compilers on homogeneous computing devices. So in other words, on CPUs, we moved from building compilers for CPUs to building compilers for GPUs for graphics applications, which is it's a whole other different challenge. And eventually, in more recent times, like since I left, GPUs are used a lot in machine learning. So that company is now like a specialist in GPU architectures for machine learning. It's a really cool company.
That is really interesting, and yeah, we'll definitely touch on that more in the later in the podcast, because I don't think I've had anyone on that's done some lower level programming. Certainly not down to that level. So that is very cool. Makes my head hurt a bit trying to understand it, but really interesting nonetheless. So when you are really trying to get in the zone and perhaps doing some low level programming, what type of music do you like to listen to?
Great question. I don't do any of the low level stuff anymore. It's kind of all just way like the concepts are like still there. I can still explain some basics of compiler stuff.
Yeah.
But I don't program in C or C++ anymore. Music. I really like heavy metal, heavy rock. I've gotten in the last few years in particular, and it's now my default coding music. I've got into like synthwave. It's like a kind of weird kind of electronica genre that combines old school sounding synthy stuff with modern electronic music. There's like Laserhawk are really good. Com Truise. It's a spoonerism of Tom Cruise. Gunship, Tech Noir, all that stuff. Yeah, have a listen to that because it's like not got like lyrics and stuff, so it's just like a really fast, cool beat. Just get the headphones on.
That sounds good. I like one genre I like to go to is like a bit of vaporwave, even if it's a bit corny.
It's the same idea. It's the same idea. Yeah, it's very similar stuff.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun, and anything that makes you feel like a hacker when you're coding is always a good one to have. And what about when you like to work? Would you say you're like early bird, night owl?
Oh, okay. I'm more of a night owl. I tend to be able to think better in the evening for some reason. I don't know what it is. The screen. I don't know if my screen sometimes feels like my screen takes a whole day to warm up, and like when I look at it in the morning, I'm like, this thing doesn't make any sense. And then by the evening, it's almost like I'm connected with it. It's almost like the screen's in my eyes, and I know exactly what's going on. And then I've got to try and turn it off and go to bed. So I'm definitely more of a night owl. And mornings are a bit slow for me. What about yourself?
I'd say I'm probably the same. I've started switching to more as I've got older. I used to be an extreme night owl, but these days as I've got older, I've switched more to early mornings. I mean, when I was in uni, I mean, I question how much, and I'm sure if my sort of tutors were listening to this now, they'd question how much work I was actually doing. But when that work did get done, it was probably at 3 a.m. Rather than sort of 7 a.m. I would say these days I'm much better at getting up in the morning. But as for like if I'm doing anything useful at 6 a.m., I'm not so sure. So if I get in the zone, there's not really an avian analogy for a late afternoon. I'm a late afternoon bird, I guess. It's probably probably around now. I mean, it's 6 p.m, so probably around now is quite good for me.
What bird would that be? I wonder.
Yeah, I don't know if there's any evolutionary advantage for hanging around in the middle of the afternoon. Maybe a parrot. I like parrots, so let's say mid-afternoon parrot.
Let's go with that. Why not?
And you already talked about what interested you in the industry originally, but if we're talking when you were sort of like 9 or 10, what did you want to be when you were an adult? But at that point, were you already interested in tech, or was that more something developed when you were older?
That's a good question. When I was at school and stuff, early days of school, I wanted to be like a fighter pilot or something like that. Like when I was like really, really wee. And then as I went to high school, I got really into like school here. We've got we called it tech studies, I think it's all changed now, but basically you done like a bit of electronics, you done a bit of like structures and bridges and all that kind of stuff. And I was like, oh yeah, I want to be an engineer. I want to be a civil engineer. So up until before I left school, I was maybe about a year or so before I left school, I was convinced I wanted to be a civil engineer of some kind. And I was lucky enough. I wasn't particularly great at school. I was really slow with pretty much all my subjects at school. I was always the bottom or like near the bottom of the classes that I was in, and my parents paid for a maths tutor to come and help me with my maths, particularly at higher maths, which I struggled with to start with. And I chatted to my maths tutor quite a lot about different things in uni and stuff like that. She was just finishing uni, so she was like, "Why don't you go and do computing at uni? You're really good with computers." And I had never thought about that at that point, so that was really good. I was quite glad. I was quite glad that she said that, because looking back now, that's a really hugely pivotal moment in my life, like unbelievably so. And I know from speaking to people and working with people since, and particularly in the last few years where I've been doing things like Code Clan and teaching there, that there are moments like that where somebody can make a difference in your life by sitting you down and being like, "Here, why don't you just try this? Why don't you think about that? Why don't you, nothing wrong with your idea, but like, just why don't you? They're not saying you have to or I think you should. They're just saying, what about this? I
It's
could have easily, yeah,
yeah, presenting you with the option. It's just it's a lot of the time someone who's maybe 17, there's a million things going on in your head anyway, and actually if there's a career path you haven't even thought of, then just having an adult you trust just say, why don't you do this, is a great experience. It sounds like obviously very pivotal for you, so it's really cool.
yeah. It was looking back, it's such a weird one. Like, um, she didn't mean it from a point of view of like, what are you doing, you crazy person? It was just like a flippant suggestion in a way. And I had just kind of looked her in the eye and was like, you know what? Actually, you're right. Like, why don't I? I think the thing that held me back, thinking back, was that I didn't do computing at school. Um, I think there was an assumption that you had to do computing at school, um, and then I guess that later in my career, I learned that you don't have to have a career. You don't have to have a degree to be able to do this stuff either, as we're all very much aware.
Yeah, well, there's a million different ways into the industry. I mean,
Absolutely.
My school didn't offer computing past when we were 13. So it's which isn't great, because I left secondary school in 2013, high school for the American listeners. So really, no excuse really. They made us take Latin, but they yeah, so it really tells you where the priorities are at. Unfortunately, I'm not sure how much it's changed really, because I speak to quite a lot of my followers on TikTok in particular. My podcast listeners tend to be a bit older, but my TikTok followers are often like either sixth form or starting university, and it sounds like there's still not quite enough clear pathways, even if it's improving slowly. So hopefully we'll be able to present more kids with that option of what a great and rewarding career this is. And we already talked a little bit about how your journey into tech started, but you went into low level and you developed some experience there. What happened after that, and how did you go from doing that and then working your way up and being a senior instructor and now doing what you're doing now? So it's interesting to hear about the journey. How did it all happen, basically? I guess I'm asking you your life story.
I appreciate you asking. It's really nice to have somebody ask and take such an interest. So thanks very much, genuinely. I worked at this place, Codeplay, for 7 years, and really liked it there. And I could see myself probably working there my entire life. At one point, I thought I'd be one of these people who went to a company and was there for 35 years. I was like, this is the one for me. This is the one for me. I'm going to stick at this forever. But one of the things that I started to notice was that everybody in the company was smarter than I was, in terms of their ability to like be extremely technical and code. My superpower was that I was able to communicate. I was able to speak to people. So I was doing stuff like speaking to customers and leading the team and kind of helping out with the direction of the teams and what we should do. I wasn't doing a huge amount of low level coding. I was doing a bit here and there, but there was other people in the company that were significantly better. So I sort of almost kind of was the person who like stuck it all together and turned it into a product. And around that time, around this sort of 2012, 2013, I started to hear about things like Node.js, which is basically it's a way of running JavaScript on a computer, and that might sound like to a lot of people. Of course, you can run JavaScript on a computer, but one of the things about Node.js that's particularly interesting is that up until around the time that Node came out, which I think was around that time, 2010, 2011,
Yeah, I think it's 2010.
Yeah, something like that. It started to get popularity. It exploded onto the tech scene, and people were talking about it on Hacker News, left, right, center. And I remember being very confused about what it was. Right? Oh, you need to run Node. You need to get Node. You need to learn Node. And that happens today more than you can imagine. This sensationalism of a particular technology. So I remember hearing about this Node thing and not really knowing what it was all about. But if you don't know what it is, it's basically a way of running JavaScript from your terminal, right? That was the kind of thing that I wish that someone just sat me down and said, you can run JavaScript from your terminal with this program, because it might not seem obvious, but you couldn't do that up until then. The only place you could run JavaScript up until that point was your browser. And I know that you know this, but your listeners might not appreciate that. But so things like that started popping up. Things like Docker started popping up. I started learning a lot more about startups. I was lucky enough to be sent with that job. I was lucky enough to be sent to California for conferences. So I went to conferences in California. I went to 2 conferences in California, and I went to visit customers a couple of times in California as well. I went to Hong Kong, and it was the traveling that made me really realize that there was a whole world outside of the world that I was in at that place and time, and it almost made me want to change my entire career. It made me want to rethink everything. It made me want to, it made me interested in startups and companies and businesses and products. And this idea of a product, which obviously, I'm not saying products were a new idea, but a digital product was a new idea to me. Up until that point, me and a lot of other people thought that to sell a digital product, you had to like literally burn it to a CD-ROM and sell it. You put a price on the box and sell it.
It makes you think how much it's changed, really, actually, because we're talking a timescale like. This is actually only a decade ago, and actually, it's how selling a digital product, the distribution for that it's not. I've never even thought about that. It's a really interesting way of saying it.
It's really amazing. Yeah, we had a big cupboard in the Codeplay Towers. It was full of like old jewel cases, those CD cases. And I was like, why are there so many jewel cases here? And it's basically, it turns out that they bought a bunch thinking they were going to sell a bunch of these compilers on a disc, and like only like a handful of people bought them. And there was like tons and tons and tons and tons of these discs. We had a compiler called Vector C. And the old timers out there that still remember Vector C. hello to you. We had a compiler out there called Vector C, and at one point we were printing it on I wasn't around for that particular part, but I heard the stories. We're printing it on these CD-ROMs and selling it. It's an interesting change in business model. Around that time, all that was happening, and I was learning about it, and I wanted to get a slice of it. So I started finding startups in Edinburgh and all the rest of it, and decided to move to a startup where I was going to be a coder, but I wasn't going to be writing C++. Instead, I was going to be writing like Node and Python and things like that. So I had to sort of teach myself those. And that's a running theme in this industry. You need to be able to teach yourself things. And I had been trying to kind of do C++, and I was okay with that, but I wasn't a master of it by any means. And I really had to pick myself up and try and learn some learn some, go back to the stuff that I learned at uni to some extent, and learn some new technologies like Node.js, JavaScript. I hadn't learned any JavaScript by that point at all, and then try and pivot myself back towards being an engineer.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, it must be very different suddenly working on. I guess it was more web focused stuff you were working on then after that. So a real shift in kind of the product.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And so something, slightly switching topic here, and something that intrigued me when we were chatting pre-show, and I thought, instead of asking you exactly what you mean by this off air, I'll ask it on air, because I've been I wanted to know what you strongly distinguish between coding and software engineering. Can you explain what you mean by that, and why it's important?
Yeah, okay, that's a good question. So, as I got into teaching 4 years ago, when I moved to CodeClan to teach there, teaching has been an amazing thing for me in my development. It's made me think about everything I've ever learned. It's made me reflect on all the experiences I've ever had. I'm not the kind of person I'm quite a slow person, actually. It takes me quite a while to understand a subject. If somebody's saying something that's quite complex, I usually can't take it in straight away. I usually have to think about it a little bit. I think there's a lot of people like that, actually, and there's more and more people like that. So I've always found that once I understand something, that's it. It's there forever. It takes me a while to get it, but once it's there, it's there. So I sort of got a really good knack of explaining things from first terms, explaining why you need something and what you should do with that. And while I was doing that, I realized, and I think I already knew that I knew it, but I already knew it, but I didn't know I knew it, sort of thing, that really coding is just one part of software engineering. Okay, so software engineering is the discipline of coding. Coding is to me, coding is like the mandatory skill that you need to master to be able to unlock the rest of your career. And the rest of your career is software engineering. And you can't do software engineering without coding. But you can do coding without software engineering. So the way I say it, the way I think about it is coding is what you do to get a computer to do some basic commands, right? It's the way of getting a computer to do something complex, and it is very complex, especially as a beginner. It's not an easy learning coding, and coding itself is a very complicated thing. It's apparently, according to some people, it's the most complicated invention of the human race. Is this idea of digital programming. Most coders are coding to build software, and they're not all trying to build, the next Zencaster, the next Gmail, insert software of choice here. Some are just coding to perform some analysis. You might be a data scientist and you want to churn some numbers. You might be a business analyst and you want to churn some numbers and pull some data in, push some data out, and the smoke goes up the chimney just the same. And you might. So the goal of having some code to write is normally to get something to work. Software engineering takes that to the next level, and what it says is we want to build code, and this is the important part for me at least, right? We want to build code that isn't just code. We want to build code that can be maintained by someone. We want to build code that can be extended. We want to build code that can be passed around. It might be that I make some code and I build it in my team, and then after a couple of years, my team passes that ownership of that code to somebody else. We want to make it so that can happen. We want to make it so our code's readable, and it can be poured over by other coders, and they can ask questions of it. We want to make it so it can be refactored and reused. We want to make it so that the whole while, all this code, it needs to be robust enough to not fail, which is a whole other set of things. So it's that code has got to run on a server, and it's got to run that server for 24 hours a day, for hopefully 365 days a year, and for many years, hopefully as well. So what I'm trying to make you aware of is, at least from my point of view, is coding is the act of you typing in code and something happens, whereas software engineering is making sure that that is maintainable, extendable, reusable, etc., etc. And that is the art. That is the mastery of this career that we've chosen. The coding is just the tip of the iceberg. Sadly, I'm sorry if you're out there learning coding, and I know that I can guarantee you that you've got an amazing career ahead of you, because it's not one of these careers where you start right once you've learned to code, that's it. You've literally got an endless supply of other things to learn, but that's a good thing, right? That's a really, really positive thing. I don't ever want to scare anyone away by saying there's no roof to this. One of the things that I had written down to say was that there's no roof to the amount of things you can learn in this career. So for me, it's making sure that it's not just code. It's something that can be maintained, and passed around and built on and engineered and made, really, really robust for many years to come. And the art of doing that and the mastery of doing that is what makes software engineering different from just coding. I hope that's okay.
That makes a lot of sense, and I agree with the distinction for sure, because it technically, coding is just as simple as writing, if we're talking JavaScript, just writing console.log, hello world. Whereas actually, if we're talking software engineering, it's like, why does the end user need this? Who is our end user? How's a whole full stack process and stack look like? And there's so many things to consider. And I agree with you. That is what's interesting about it, because there's not a finite number of things that you're going to learn. And no matter whether you're longer term, like for me, I probably see myself more going down the people management side of code. For me, it's then like I can think about how would I build like a effective software engineering team, or if I decide to go down the principal, like individual contributor side of things, I could then think about like how can I make a amazing architecture, and there's so much to touch on. And similarly, I wanted to ask you about is maybe someone who hasn't even got to the point where they've coded yet. What would you advise them? Like maybe they're in a position like. We were talking about leaving school. Say you were actually in that position where, but imagine your maths tutor had never suggested it. You get out of school at 18 and you're like, oh, wait a minute, I think I want to get into tech, but I really don't know where to start. What would you advise them? Does it matter what kind of tech they choose or anything like that?
Good question. I've thought about this one a lot, as you can imagine, over the years, particularly somebody, I've had to try and put myself in these shoes. I'm not a self-taught. I'm not originally self-taught. That's the thing, right? So I've had to put myself in these shoes, and it's not been that hard to do that, because I've met so many of people in this situation. What would I recommend? What would I wouldn't know what to do, right? I'd be freaking out. Is the real answer. I just want to say that I have a tremendous amount of respect for people that do things like change the career and the radically, and quit a job in whatever it is that they're doing to go and pursue becoming a software engineer or getting into tech in some way. Particularly the people that go and do stuff like Code Clan, or the people that stay up to at least the wee small hours, on learning online. And cramming as much as they can. I've got a huge amount of respect for that because I don't think I could have done that myself. But I realise I'm not answering your question by saying that. Um, what would I recommend? Knowing what I know now, I would say that the technology choice really, really, really does not matter, especially like to begin with, in particular. There are some technologies that you should maybe avoid, I would say, from my own sort of personal view is that anything proprietary you should maybe avoid. Like I wouldn't recommend friends. If a really good friend came to me and said, I'm going to become a coder, I'm going to become a software engineer, Colin, what should I do? I would tell them to avoid anything proprietary. And yeah, your agreement, which is great. It's just not particularly great way to go down. What does that mean if you're sitting there and you're thinking, what the hell does proprietary mean? So it might not be obvious to somebody who's at that stage of I'm thinking about a career in software. It might not be obvious that most of software, pretty much 90 odd percent of all decent modern software engineering is all done using open source technologies. That means that it's technologies that can be contributed to by almost anyone on the planet that's capable and willing. And it also means that the software, the code for that software can be looked at and inspected by virtually anyone that has an internet connection. And I think when I tell non-tech people that, it kind of blows their head off a little bit. I've seen people going, what? And kind of one eye gets raised, another eye gets closed, and their brain starts to spin a little bit. So going into something that, one big recommendation is to go into something that uses open source. Virtually any programming language you've heard of is open source in some way. They're not all entirely open source. It's maybe easier to name programming languages that aren't open source or technologies that aren't open source. One that I remember hearing quite a lot about a while ago, and if you've got a career in that, that's great, but it's something that I would never go for myself, is SAS, S-A-S. It's like a statistics package thing for doing, it's got its own language and it's got its own library. You pay a tremendous license fee for. I personally would never recommend to any friends of mine that are starting a career to touch that unless you knew that you wanted to do that specifically. Oracle can be a bit like that, from what I know. I've heard that. I'm not saying don't do a career in Oracle. I've never said that to someone.
Possibly with the exception of Java. Which I think, but even then, I think Java's technically not open source, is it? But I mean, obviously, Java, the ecosystem is so strong that that's probably it's a decent one to know. Probably not the best one to know, but a good one. Like you're never going to struggle for a job if you know Java. Really, I would say.
Java, 100%. I'm a massive Java coder myself. I love Java. Java has a lot of open source stuff behind it. Tons and tons and tons and tons. There is the releases of Java that are closed source, the official releases from Oracle are all closed source, but there's tons and tons of open source versions that you can get a hold of.
Yeah, because it's hybrid, really, isn't it?
Yeah. So my recommendation is to not be fussy over your language, not be fussy over your technology, and try and immerse yourself in as many experiences as possible. You might not like something, and if you don't, then just try something else. It's really one of the most important things that I've learned to give that kind of advice is to don't pin yourself to something too early. Don't read about front end and React and think, right, that's me. I'm going to be a React coder for the rest of my life. Don't pin that on yourself. There's no point. There's your career is probably going to be long enough for you to dabble your feet in many different things. You could spend a couple of years doing something like you could do front end stuff where you're building websites and web applications. And then you might go and do something completely different that involves data analysis or machine learning. And in those years that you do in data analysis and machine learning, which could be years and years and years after you've done your front end stuff, it's really important to understand that you might have forgotten all of that front end stuff. I've had jobs where I've been writing Python production code, and I can't really remember how to write Python code. So, but the point I'm making here is, it's really not that important as long as you've got a willingness to move around and experience different things. Being open-minded is the more important thing here, and also being honest with yourself. Right, the amount of people that I've met in my career that are like, oh, have to go to work again, have to go to deal with this bloody PHP code base. It's like, well, if you hate it that much, I don't know if you know, but software industry is looking for developers, like, have you heard, there's demand for your skill, just change career, oh no, but then I have to update my CV. And that's to do with this growth mindset thing, right? That's something we hear about quite a lot, like being open-minded and having a growth mindset. They're the two most important things to have a successful career in software engineering and coding and technology. And as long as you're willing to change and move things around, there is no wrong path. There is really no wrong path. There are some that are, in my opinion, not what I would choose or what I would recommend to my friends, but generally no wrong path.
Yeah, absolutely. And, even if you try something, a first programming language, and it's not really for you, and try another, like, for example, Matthew, who was on a couple of weeks ago, he was just saying, he just loves Ruby on Rails, and he said it just jives with him, like nothing else ever has. So why would he change? But I've personally tried Ruby, and I always found it a bit jarring how close to plain English it was. And whilst it was good, and I could see why someone would like it, something about JavaScript, I can't even say what it is, really, just worked for me. So I tried learning JavaScript, Ruby, and Python, and I think I preferred JavaScript the most, then Ruby, then Python. Because Python I found like function declarations and stuff quite confusing, and as quite a messy person who didn't know about linters, the spacing was really confusing for me. Nowadays I can write Python fine, but it was all the stuff with spacing. So I agree with you, and I definitely encourage people to don't, if you try one, you're not sure you like it, it doesn't mean coding's not for you. Just try another one, the major ones. Like I just named off 3 great ones to try, but there's plenty out there, and the list keeps on growing, for sure.
It does indeed.
Yeah, and obviously you have hands-on experience teaching yourself at CodeClan, which obviously has a fantastic reputation here in Scotland. What patterns have you noticed in people that are trying to learn to code, and how can people be like efficient and effective during their learning process?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So, I found some really interesting things actually, and some of this might shock you or it might surprise you. It might not. I found that the nerdy, computery ones that go into bootcamp often don't perform as well as you would think, which I found that quite interesting.
Why do you think that is?
I think that's because of a level of cockiness. Usually, I've seen tons of people come into the boot camps in CodeClan, and you can sometimes tell. We used to have a sort of chat between instructors. You can sometimes tell, and they would do like a meet and greet like 2 weeks before they start, the students. So we'd get them to come in 2 weeks before, and we'd give them their laptops, and we'd like get them all set up and give them a couple of like mini lessons. And then, or it was maybe more than 2 weeks before, but give them a couple of mini lessons, and you would do your first kind of class lesson, and it'd be things like setting up Git, initializing, they're getting their GitHub account set up, and sometimes you can see straight off the bat that there's some quite confident people in there, and there's confidence. Right. And that's great. We love confidence. We want people to be confident. Absolutely. But there's confidence with a little touch of cockiness. And I've noticed that generally, like straight off the bat, we can tell as instructors, we can tell if that person's a little bit cocky, they may be going to struggle. And I think that's probably because if they've maybe done a little bit of tech stuff previously, they might like assume that they know some stuff, and as a result, they might switch off to the learning. And I think one of the biggest mistakes to make at that level is thinking that you know, and thinking I don't need to know that. I've already got that down. Um, that's quite a big mistake to make, particularly early on, because even if you do know the thing, please listen to it being explained again, because it might be explained in a different way. And if you know it, then what to do is just give yourself a little pat on the back and go, "Yeah, that's exactly how I thought about that." So conversely, the ones who have done the best out of that I've in my experience, anecdotally, of course, are the ones that have that kind of mindset of, you know, I don't know everything, and I'm here to learn, and I want to learn, and I'm willing to learn. And I realize that this might be tough, and it's going to be very hard, and it's going to be quite at times, dare I say, even demoralizing, because it's a very putting yourself through something like Code Clan is really a roller coaster. That's what we used to say to people. It's a roller coaster. You have your days where you're absolutely on a high, you're getting it all right, your code works, you're learning it, it makes sense. You have days where you've got a low, it's not working, your code doesn't make sense, you're confused, you're stuck. So that can happen, and like that, that can change so quickly. So I would say that the people that do better are the ones that ask questions, were interested, immersed themselves with no distractions. That's really important. We used to have people come in and they'd try and work a weekend job, and it would never work. Remember one guy came in every Monday morning. He'd come in at like 10 or 11 o'clock. We would start at 9:15 on the dot for stand up. We used to do stand up at Code Clan. I really like that about Code Clan, actually. We used to get everyone to do a stand up, and your stand up would just be like a little bit of how you got on at the weekend, and how you got on with the homework, and just generally how you're feeling about life. It's like more of a mental health stand up, I'd say, that we used to do at Code Clan. It's quite good. I know if you've got distractions at the weekend, it can be really hard to get that person through the course. Ask questions. Don't be afraid to ask questions. That's really one of the most important ones. It's really quite difficult to get people that are starting out on their coding career to ask questions, particularly in a classroom full of other people starting out in their coding career.
And when you're all adults as well, no one wants to feel... You develop, like when you're a kid, I mean, obviously you're self-conscious as a kid, but like as an adult, there's an extra degree of not wanting to feel silly compared to everyone else in a group, especially if you feel like everyone else gets it. But actually it can be the situation where 20 people in the room don't get it and everyone's just afraid to ask, because there's going to be points where you're not going to, like, I freely admit that React, I love it now, but JSX, I made me want to smash my head off my desk every day.
Yeah.
I didn't get it for weeks, and then it clicked eventually. But yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. It's not all going to click. The amount of times I've stood in front of a classroom, and I kind of miss it to some regard, to be honest with you, and just stood there and just explain a topic, and then just look out and try and get some eye contact with someone. And you get a nod of a head, or you just get blank stares, or you can hear a pin drop, or you get somebody that cocks their head, and you go, right, okay, well, what are you thinking? I learned as a teacher, as an instructor, particularly of such complicated stuff, and to adults, as you say, it's really important to like just look for those signals and look and see what they're doing, and like, does somebody have their head cocked to one side? Generally, like, humans can be quite easy to read like that. Does it? You'll have heard of Uncle Bob, Bob Martin. He's got a few great talks, but one of his favorite little bits of blurb is when he says, does this code make you cock your head to the side? Does it make you kind of go like that and kind of lean over and go, what's that doing? It's the same with people. If you see people doing that, then generally they're confused and you need to help them. So, it's what the point I'm making is, it's really important that you're honest with yourself and you ask questions, even though you might feel like an idiot, and that's super important. I had a really fun exercise a couple of years ago. So at Code Clan, we were lucky enough to be given a contract with one of the banks where we weren't doing kind of bootcamp stuff. We were giving training to graduates, and that was a really good, really fun project. And this particular group of graduates that I worked with, they would kind of split their time between Glasgow and London, and they had just came back from London, and they'd done this really like big thing where they built a trading platform, and they'd done it without us. We'd done it without, it wasn't part of Code Clan, it was separate. And then they came back, and they had this situation where they all came back, and they were away for a week and came back to me and my class. And I was like, right, everyone, how did it go? I want to tell me more about your trading platform. I really want to know. I got a bunch of blank stares, and then eventually someone said, "Oh, we built a trading platform," and then they gave me like the spiel, like the sentence, like the label name of what they built, and I just was like, "So what's that?" Blank stares, silence. I could see exactly what was going on. They all went away for a week, and they were paired up with like other graduates from other like universities and things like that to build this system, and they hadn't a clue what they had built. Right? They hadn't a clue what they had built. They had been put through this extra training thing that the bank wanted them to do. They came out of it and they knew bits of what they were trying to do, but they didn't really know. Like they were coding, yeah, and they were solving some sort of problem, yeah, but they were making that grave mistake of not really understanding, because they were essentially in it as a competition, and none of them wanted to stick their hand up and say at any point during that, "I don't know what we're doing. Can someone explain that to me, please?" And I can see why they did that, because it was kind of they were being pitched against like graduates from like a lot of quite elite universities and things. So it's like Code Clan trained versus like Cambridge, and the Cambridge guys and girls, they were like coming in and like leading the conversations, and the Code Clan ones were kind of sticking back and not really sure. So I spent an entire day asking why at every single thing that they said. So I would say, "So what was the trading platform you built?" And then somebody would say, "Oh, it's a blah, 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 blah for XYZ. And I'd be like, "What's XYZ? And they'd be like, "Oh, it's this." And I'd be like, "Don't understand. Explain that." So we spent an entire day of me just asking dumb questions. And the point of that day was one of the best days I ever had teaching. The point of that day was that if you don't ask the question, you're never going to know. Like, what's even more worse than that is if you don't ask the question early on and understand what you're building and what you're trying to do, what the problem is, if you move to the next level, if you move to the next phase of anything, without knowing the fundamental of what it is we're here to do, you're screwed after that. Because it's that knowledge is built on that knowledge, which is built on that knowledge, which is built on that knowledge, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, so it's the 5 why chain.
Yeah, exactly. It's the 5 why chain. I love that.
Yeah. That's one that I learned it originally doing my business degree, because it was some kind of like product development. It was a fun module, actually. It was like some product development, entrepreneurship module that we did, and the lecturer was a really interesting guy, and he just always said, the 5 why chain, like, just got to, when you're building this and you're asking for, because it was like for a mock customer / end user, you got to ask yourself why 5 times, and it comes so handy in coding, really, when, especially if you're doing like for me, I do a lot of front end stuff, so nice. The consumers are directly interacting with what I'm doing, and to ask myself 5 times why, almost like you pretend there's a 5-year-old in the room, and it's the best way to do it, for sure.
Totally agree. I've used 5 why. I spent a little bit of time between jobs as a product manager for software engineering stuff. Kind of went out of the software engineering and was a PM for a little while, and then went back into the software engineering stuff. And during that, I worked at a company where it was like restaurant reservation software, and there was a really interesting thing that happened there where the customers would phone up the support team, and customers would say something like, "Hey, I need to be able to do X. Can I?" And then then the customer would then go ahead and basically solutionize. So the customer would be like, "I want a button that does blah." right? And then so the support person would sometimes be like, come over to the devs, can we get a button that does blah? And actually, sometimes, somehow, I don't know how it happened, quite a lot of times actually, they'd go, yeah, okay, like, we'll give you that. We'll stick that in the backlog. And then over time, we end up with this problem where we've got like all of these features and bells and whistles and buttons and switches and levers and knobs that all do different things. In some way, all do the same thing. And if the person who was asked, here, can we get a button that does blah? If the person was asked that, just went, why do you need that? They'd maybe go, well, I need to be able to make it so that I'm booked out when I'm booked out at less capacity every Wednesday. And then they'd go, why do you need to do that? Well, I've noticed that for some reason on a Wednesday, I can't send out as many emails. Oh, right. Well, that's because you've got like your email quotas down on that day. So something, so like you've scratched under the surface once, you scratch under the surface twice, you discover that there's actually a problem that they need to know about, or there's another way of fixing that other problem. Why do you want to send out so many emails on a Wednesday? Because I do promotions on a Friday, and I need to make sure that they're lined up for the Wednesday coming. Well, do you know that we've actually got a thing where you can do promotions and you can, and you don't know until you know, right? It's like the known, the unknowns and the unknown unknowns, and there's our unknown unknowns.
It's the pain point, and no matter what you do in any kind of, it doesn't even have to be a private enterprise. It can just be some kind of like
Definitely.
public service where you're just trying to provide a solution for people. If you don't find out the pain point, then you'll never solve it. It's like a salesperson. It's like if a salesperson doesn't ask their prospective client any questions about what they're struggling with, they're never going to sell the solution. Like, it's like phoning Google and trying to sell them AWS as a cloud platform. Like, it's not going to work. I mean, maybe if it is, you'll win salesperson of the century if you do it. But yeah,
Jesus, yeah. Wow.
And so something actually, if we're talking about potential exercises in futility. And what a segue I've got to say here. Leak code. This is something I think it must be an American influence, because I see a lot about it on Reddit, and particularly on TikTok recently. I've had a ton of questions from people saying, what about leak code? Do I need to know leak code? What companies use leak code? Do you know a list of companies that don't use leak code? What do you think is the state of leak code in 2022 in the UK in particular? Do graduates either of bootcamps or university need it, and how should they use it if they do?
Amazing question. I knew you were going to ask this. I thought about it a little bit, but I might change my answer on the fly. Am I allowed to swear, by the way?
You can, but I'll bleep it out. Yeah,
I'm not going to swear. That was a joke. I'm definitely not going to swear. I do swear a lot, but I'm not going to swear on your podcast. I will not do that. Let's keep it professional. So, leak code. It's a hard one to answer, right? And the reason it's a hard one to answer is because, from my point of view, a hard no, like hard, like recommendation to friends. No, you don't need that. And I'll go into why in a minute. But where was it like 5 years ago? Where was it 10 years ago? And I think my worry here is that there's a bit of divergence in hiring. There's a huge divergence in hiring. There's some hiring methodologies that are just so focused on the algorithmic stuff and the cracking the coding problems and leak code stuff and leak code grinding and solving the particular sort algorithm in like 14 different ways. And there's other coding interviews that are so far away from that you don't need to know anything about it. And so it wouldn't be very responsible for me to turn around and say you need to completely ignore it. I have noticed a difference in US hiring to UK or European hiring. Even within the organisation I work at just now, it's a little bit different the way we do hiring at Fanduel. I've noticed even then it's like we hire UK people different from how we hire them in the US, and I don't know why that is. Like it seems to be something that something that US companies want to be able to have more of a, maybe they want to be able to have more of a binary assessment of someone, maybe. So in order to do that, to just give it a straight up yes or straight up no, they just give them something that can have a binary answer. You can either crack this complicated leak code problem or you can't, and that might make it easier for hiring. The worry there is obvious for me. It's that you could be rejecting people that are amazing engineers that have amazing potential but are really good leak code grinders. And engineering is not about grinding leak code. That cannot be over. I cannot emphasize that enough. That's so far from what we do day to day. I could name a million things to learn before that. So if you're in the US, then maybe. If you're in the UK or Europe, then maybe too. But I would personally not like to go and work for a company that assesses me purely based on my ability to solve obscure algorithmic problems like that. I don't want to work somewhere like that. I want to work somewhere that's going to look at me, and it's going to look at all my experiences, and it's going to look at the other things that I can do as a developer, as an engineer, because there's more to being an engineer than just that. So no, it's not required.
Yeah, definitely not required. I mean, I've had people ask me all the time, being like, "You must have faced it at some point." I've never faced it in. I'm on my third programming job at the moment, and I've never faced it. I think for my technical assessment of my current employer, Holland and Barrett, I think they gave me an hour and they gave me a few things that I could choose to do, and I built them a retrieval engine that would give them a collage of dog gifs from an API. So from that, it's different from leak code as you can get, but it was very fun and it was interesting to do that with them. So yeah, I mean, if people want to do it, then they can do it. In particular, if you want to get into Fang, or Manga as it's now been rechristened apparently, with Facebook going to Meta, which I think is a cooler acronym, then yeah, maybe.
That is actually.
Yeah, it's. I wonder if Zuckerberg did that deliberately, but yeah, it seems like it's one of those ones that doesn't need to. You can learn it if you want, but like much more valuable things to learn.
I think there's a trap. Of it's. I think it can be quite addictive. It can be competitive coding. It's like a thing. It wasn't a thing. Wasn't a thing back in my day. Like type situation. It's a thing. It's a thing now. I think it can be quite easy to get sucked into that and think to yourself and kid yourself on that you're doing loads of good training, and actually you're just probably wasting your time on. I'm not saying ignore it, because you need to know some basics. You need to know you need to know that if I take a for loop and I put another for loop inside that for loop, stuff's going to slow down. If I do another for loop inside that again, it's going to slow down even more. And for every for loop I add, it gets that many times, like to like that many times, like cubed, or to the power of 4 or to the power of 5, slower, basically. Like that's the really high level. And this is where I would say the most important thing is to really just make sure you understand the absolute fundamentals of anything before being obsessed about the details. So what I mean by that is there's no point you grinding the hell out of leak code when you don't understand why something gets slower if you nest the loops. There's no point you spending all of your time on leak code or something like that, but not really being able to understand how the basics of the internet works. I think I might echo in a few of the sentiments of your other guests in saying this. Like, understand how request response works. Try and figure out what happens to the information when you press enter, when you type something into a URL bar. Like what's going on there. having basic understandings of all these things is much more important than like being able to like pass, coding exams or whatever.
Yeah,
In my opinion.
definitely. And while we're on the topic of leveling up, let's say someone's already in their career. I mean, just use me as an example. Someone that's been a software engineer full time for like 3 years now. Someone at my experience level, like get mid level, just mid level. How would you say someone like me should level up throughout their career?
It's a very different answer, actually. So the answer to that question, if you're at the beginning, just to make sure we're getting the reflection here, if you're at the very, 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 very beginning, then what you want to do is you want to avoid tutorials as much as possible. You want to focus on fundamental learning. You want to focus on why, what is an object, what is a class, what do those things really mean. You don't need to go into the details of the memory and how many bytes it's taking up, unless you are doing something like C++. So fundamentals are important. Focus on those. Focus on first terms. Understand something for the sake of understanding it. Don't just be able to regurgitate it. Avoid tutorials if you're the very, very beginning, right?
That's the reason why tutorial hell is a popular expression.
Yeah, tutorial hell. We've all been there, right?
Yeah.
To answer your question on somebody, a bit more into their career, tutorials, have at it, right? Because if you're a bit more in your career, you should be able to follow a tutorial and understand the why, understand the fundamentals. You should be able to pick up any programming language once you've cracked the first two, right? What a lot of people think, and I've noticed a lot of beginners obsess over is, and it's a natural thing that beginners will always do no matter what. There's no way we can talk them out of it. Is beginners are always going to obsess over syntax. It's really, really, really easy for beginners to get totally hung up on why put that bracket there, put that space there, put that semicolon there, and it's reasonable for them to think that, because that's how our brain works, right? Our brain works by learning code, like by a sequence of characters and lines, right? That's how we learn code. We learn code by typing it in, and stuff happens. And then you learn that like not having that semicolon there is going to cause a problem, which means it's not going to run, which means it's not going to work. And then you go through that loop for like a couple of years or a year, right? And then you get to the point where you know how to type it in, and you know how to not make those mistakes. But then comes the next part, which is understanding really what's going on. It's the semantics. It's the what's actually happening here. And your brain sort of starts to change at that point. It starts to think about problems differently. You lose, once you move away from the beginner stages of learning to code, you move away from that obsession over syntax, over bracket positions and characters, and you start to think about it less as a language. I think your average person in the street who doesn't have a clue about anything to do with this stuff, they assume that it's like learning a language.
Yeah, I thought that before I started.
It's really not. It's almost just like, it's like puzzle solving, really, more than learning a language. Once you get over the learning of the language part, you can learn any of these languages, and you can learn it by assimilating it back to the one you know previously, and you can compare the syntax and go, well, I can do exactly the same thing in this language that I can in that language, but it means the same thing, and I can translate that over. So when you get to that level, tutorials are so useful. You can look at some tutorials, you can see how to do things. You're not a complete beginner anymore. You can learn as much as you can on the internet. There are bad tutorials out there. Videos for me are the way that I learn, through videos.
Yeah, I'm quite similar like that.
Just any way possible. It's at that stage, it's kind of really tapping into how you learn. One important point I'll make, though, is to try and always look at the documentation. I know that's quite a hard thing to do, because documentation can sometimes be really painful to read. It can sometimes be painful to find. So if you're a couple of years in, you want to level up, one thing you can always do is like make sure you're looking at the reference documentation for that particular technology. If you can't find it, keep digging. A good place to start is the GitHub, and then dig in from there. If you find yourself reading the actual source code, there's nothing wrong with that at all. It's probably open source anyway. Always try and make sure that you're looking at the latest version of a particular thing. Many times I've been, skilling up by following some sort of tutorial to later find that I've followed version 3 of the tutorial and version 4 is out now. But version 4 is actually really different, and I've just learned React Router v3. Do you know what I mean? Where I should have been learning React Router v4.
Or even worse, I've heard of people learning AngularJS when they've been meaning to learn Angular, which it was. I'm not going to get into this, but it was borderline irresponsible to not call it something else.
I know, it's totally. You're totally right. What else is good for learning? YouTube is brilliant. I don't know. Yeah. What would I do? I was learning Rust over the last year and a half. I'm still kind of going back and forward to that. Rust's a great language in that they've got an amazing book just on their website. It's hard to kind of point around that. YouTube videos, things like front end masters and
front end masters is great. There's front end mentor. That's amazing for anyone that hasn't tried that. It's I don't know if you've seen it, but they give you like all the components of a final project. And they have some really simple ones and some really complicated ones. They give you all the components and like assets, and they basically you have to build you have to replicate a site using it, and that's all free, I think. So that's really cool. There's really a wealth of it's almost like you're spoilt for choice, because obviously you've got the other ones like Free Code Camp, the Odin project, and that sort of thing. You just there's so much out there. It's like you said, like you said earlier in the pod, the ecosystem has changed so much over the past sort of 10 years. It's it's a fantastic time to learn to code. And talking changing ecosystems, obviously we live somewhere that has changed rapidly again over a similar timescale in terms of like how in terms of tech. What do you see as the future of Scotland's tech scene and the Central Belt in particular?
A hard question, actually. We've got a lot of how do I answer this? We've got a lot of companies doing a lot of interesting things. My issue with that, though, is, and I've seen this happen more times than is necessary, is there's quite a lot of early stage startups, and I don't mean that in a bad way. It's great that there's early stage startups. That's brilliant, because that means stuff for the economy. That means stuff for growth. That's investment. Blah 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 blah. All those good things, right? And I'm a huge startup advocate. I love startups. I've worked on a few startups. I'll maybe have a startup one day. Hopefully, maybe we'll see. No promises. The thing that I see a lot happening, though, is I see early stage software engineers, beginning of their career, going into early stage startups, and it does not go well. And it's really not a good thing. And it really makes me quite hurt to see that. And the reason it doesn't go well is because, I'm sorry to tell you, if you're out there and you want to go and join a startup, I would try and encourage you to not. And the reason being is if you get hired into an early stage startup with somebody, particularly if it's a non-technical founder, which it often is, in my experience, I've worked with a few, not good, in my experience at least, then you're going to be the person that company depends on to build their technology, and you do not want to be starting your first job as the only developer in that company. No, I've seen that happen too many times, and it's very irresponsible of the employer to even think that they could put that amount of pressure on. Sometimes it's out of sheer ignorance. They don't know. They just think they need a coder. They just think they need a software engineer. Hire software engineer, junior salary, and insert magic here, and then inevitably that person learns nothing in a year and a half. They get stressed at their head. Their boss gets really annoyed with them because they're not able to build what they were asked to build because they're still learning. We're all always learning, but they're the very beginning of learning. So I've seen quite a lot of startups fail on that. I've seen quite a lot of people's careers get off to a shaky start on that. I'm very hopeful for the bigger startups though. The companies that have been there and done that. There's a really great company. There's a few really great companies like, Fanduel and Skyscanner are obvious ones. There's companies like Boundary Technologies that I've heard are really good. I couldn't name them all, but there's tons and tons of companies that are like small, medium size companies to work for. Tech scene wise, in general, I don't know what way it's going to go with Scotland. I like to think that there's just going to be tons and tons of really good product companies and really good software as a service type companies, with that kind of business model of all doing various things.
Yeah.
Games is still a thing. I think it's not really something that I've really been that keen on.
Yeah. Well, Rockstar got 2 offices in Scotland alone, so definitely still a lot going on.
Yeah, definitely a lot going on there. I don't know. The future in general is very much going to be machine learning. It's going to be, from my point of view, it's going to be making sure that people can use that. I've worked with quite a lot of like really, really clever data analysts that are obviously like really good at machine learning stuff. But I always find that they need help building the software, building the product. I know there's quite a lot of big agencies in Scotland, and some of them look really nice to work for. That looks quite nice. I've always been a little bit hesitant of those personally. Never say never, but like I would like to think I would maybe always try and stay with a product company.
I agree. I'm probably the same because you always want to be striving. I'm not sure I would be keen on working on like almost chained sort of 2 degrees of separation away. Like if you're working directly to build the same product, I think that's almost more motivating. I understand why people like the agency model, but it's not for me.
Yep. I've seen a lot of small agencies. There's a couple of good big agencies. I'll give them a shout out. And Digital, I hear really good things about.
Yeah, I've heard really good things about them as well.
A couple of people I know work there, and they swear by it. Trying really hard to recruit me. And so I would never rule out an agency like that on that level. It sounds like they're doing it all right, and I've got a lot of respect for that. But I've in the olden days, there used to be quite a lot of small agencies where it would just be a wild turkey chase. Scotland was meant to be tipped to be like a good place for space stuff. I've not seen that pan out yet, sadly. I don't know what's going on there. My hope is that we just get a lot of really good small companies that turn into big companies out the back of successes with companies like Boundary and all the rest of it. And I just hope that they keep hiring people to build good product stuff. And I'm quite glad to see, in a weird way, that, for example, at Fanduel, we've had like quite a few people come over from like sort of like the banks and stuff like that. Like not that I'm hugely down on the banks. I think they're fine. But for a while, a few years ago, it was quite hard to hire because all the hiring was just going straight to like Morgan Stanley, JP Morgan, and Barclays. And I'm now starting to see the people coming back. That'll fluctuate with the financial climate as normal. I'm not really sure what to say about the future of the Scotland other than just those little thoughts.
Yeah, I mean that's a topic in of itself,
It
and
definitely is.
definitely potentially worthy of a spin-off podcast. I've often thought about because there's a lot going on in Scotland's tech scene and interesting stuff. But yeah, I mean we've already talked around a lot of different areas, so hopefully people have got sort of a lot of value about around this. If people I was going to say if people want to get in touch with you, what's usually the best way?
Yeah, I'm on Twitter. I tweet sometimes. It's Colin_Riddell, Riddell. Yeah, I'm on GitHub, Colin-Riddell. That's not really for communication. That's just for
Just
lols, I
have a look
suppose.
around what you're working on.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I spent a little bit of time, recently, like making that look a bit prettier. So somebody may as well look at it. Yep, those places. I'm on LinkedIn as well. If you want to hit me on LinkedIn, that'd be cool. I quite like LinkedIn actually. A lot of
Yeah,
people are
it's
pretty
good.
down on it, but yeah, I quite like it. And I'm happy to hear from anybody about anything, particularly if it's stuff to do with like learning or career advice or anything like that. More than happy to help out.
Brilliant, fantastic, and so listeners, all those links will be in the description. And obviously, you've given the Code of Career plenty of time here. So, is there anything you want to shout out at all, or anything you're working on, or if you know, or yeah, just anything you need to shout out? This is your space. Anything like that?
Thanks very much. We're hiring at Fanduel. It's quite hard to hire at the moment. Fanduel is quite a good place to be. It's not the most amazing company in the world, I would say, but I'm very much enjoying it. I think a lot of people are enjoying it too, and yeah, you probably get quite a good bit of work to do in Fanduel. There's a lot of really interesting things happening if that takes your fancy. A lot of people that I know are put off by the whole betting thing. Not all of our products are betting related. Ironically, we had somebody that worked at JP Morgan say to me, "Oh, I don't want to come and work at Fanduel because of the betting thing." It's like, hold on, you used to build high frequency trading systems for JP Morgan.
Yeah,
I didn't say anything. I just kept stum, like whatever.
there's a certain
Um,
irony there, isn't there?
yeah,
Yeah, but this is classy gambling.
yeah. We make like little games and things like that at Fanduel as well, like little free to play games, and
Yeah.
there's a lot of stuff to do with infrastructure to get your teeth stuck into,
Mm.
and there's just a lot of like good engineering practices, happening at Fanduel now as well, like with learning opportunities and things.
Yeah, you do a lot of the fantasy football and that kind of thing. I saw that. That
Aye,
looked
there's
really cool.
fantasy stuff. That stuff's really interesting. I don't really understand the sports side of it. That's another thing, actually. If you are thinking about Fanduel, you don't have to be a sports person. I am not. I am not. I'm so not a sports person, and I quite like it. So hit me up if you want to come over. There's plenty of opportunities.
Brilliant, sounds good. And I'll leave some links in the description as well for people to find out more about Fanduel. But yeah, I mean, thanks once again for your time, Colin. It's been a really insightful and fun podcast to do, and I've definitely
Thanks
learned a
very
lot
much.
myself. So I'm sure the listeners have as well. So I really appreciate it.
Thanks very much. I've really enjoyed being here. It's an absolute honor, privilege, anytime. Thanks very much.
Well, and thank you as well, dear listener, for checking in with another week of the Code of Career. Really appreciate your continued support, and just always make sure to follow us on the links in the description, and especially join our Discord if you ever want to have a chat with members of the community. But until then, have a great week and happy coding.